Lucas arrived at the hotel of the Bottomless Pit under a sky painted in shades of gray, with the sun hidden behind an oppressive wall of clouds. The narrow, winding road to the hotel seemed carved out of the desolate cliffs, with jagged rocks jutting out like the broken teeth of some ancient predator. His car came to a halt in front of the imposing structure, a decrepit, three-story building whose cracked facade and darkened windows seemed to peer back at him, as if alive. The wind howled through the nearby canyon, carrying with it an eerie, almost human-like wail. For a brief moment, Lucas thought he saw a shadow move in one of the top windows, but when he blinked, it was gone. As he stepped out of the car, a strange sensation gripped him, an inexplicable heaviness, as if the air itself was weighed down by centuries of unseen horrors. In the center of the courtyard, the infamous Bottomless Pit loomed like a gaping maw, its circumference ringed by ancient, weathered stones. A rusted iron sign stood next to it, swaying slightly in the wind. It read, "Do not approach. The pit sees all." Lucas felt a chill crawl up his spine, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the darkness within. It was unnaturally black, as though it swallowed light itself. A sudden gust of wind made him stumble back, his breath catching as he swore he heard a faint whisper emanating from the depths. It sounded like his name. Inside the hotel, the atmosphere was no less unsettling. The wooden floorboards creaked under his boots, their groans echoing through the empty lobby. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing strange symbols etched into the wood beneath. Symbols that looked like they belonged to an ancient language long forgotten. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, like old blood. Lucas approached the reception desk, where a bell sat untouched. Hesitant, he pressed it, the sharp chime cutting through the heavy silence like a scream. Moments later, a woman emerged from the shadows of a back room. She was pale, with sunken eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets, and her smile was more unsettling than welcoming. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but carrying an uncanny resonance. Lucas froze. He hadn't told anyone his name. Before he could question her, she slid a key across the counter. "Room 313. The best view of the pit," she added, her tone laced with something he couldn't quite place. Was it malice or pity? As Lucas made his way to his room, the hotel seemed to shift around him. Corridors stretched longer than they should have, and doors creaked open slightly as he passed, revealing glimpses of darkened interiors. From time to time, he heard faint murmurs, as if someone were speaking just out of earshot, but the hallways were empty. Finally, he reached room 313. The door opened with a groan, revealing a sparse but clean room. The window overlooked the courtyard and the Bottomless Pit, now illuminated by the dim glow of the hotel's outdoor lanterns. As he stared out, he noticed something strange. The light from the lanterns didn't reach the pit. Its darkness remained absolute, a void untouched by the faint flicker of illumination. That night, Lucas lay awake, the weight of the pit's presence pressing down on him, even from afar. The wind outside carried with it a strange melody, a tune he vaguely recognized but couldn't place. It was haunting, weaving through his thoughts and filling him with unease. Then, in the silence of the early hours, he heard it, a knock at his door. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the stillness. He froze, his breath hitching. Gathering his courage, he called out, "Who's there?" But no answer came. The knock sounded again, louder this time, and then nothing. When he finally opened the door, the hallway was empty, but on the floor lay a small, tattered piece of paper. Scrawled in a shaky hand were the words, "The pit watches you." Lucas closed the door and locked it, but the dread remained. He could feel the hotel watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. And from the darkness outside, the pit seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. The morning light struggled to penetrate the heavy clouds over the desolate canyon as Lucas wandered through the dimly lit halls of the hotel. The air inside felt heavier than the day before, each breath carrying a faint metallic tang, like rusted iron. Shadows lingered at the edges of his vision, darting away when he turned to look. Determined to distract himself, Lucas decided to explore the building. As he walked, the unsettling silence was broken only by the groan of the old floorboards and the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. Halfway down a narrow corridor, he found a door that stood out from the others. Unlike the others, which were worn and cracked, this one was immaculate, polished wood with an intricate design carved into its surface. A brass plaque above the frame read, "Staff only." Lucas tried the handle, but it was locked. As he leaned closer, something scratched faintly against the other side of the door, like nails on wood. He stepped back, a chill racing down his spine, but his curiosity only deepened. Later that day, while speaking with the strange, pallid receptionist, she handed him a key without him asking. Her bony fingers trembled slightly as she placed it in his hand, her sunken eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him shiver. "The hotel has chosen you," she murmured cryptically. Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the lobby. Lucas examined the key. It was old, the brass tarnished and cold to the touch. Hanging from it was a small tag engraved with the number of the locked door, 313A. With equal parts dread and determination, Lucas returned to the enigmatic door. The key slid into the lock with an almost deliberate slowness, as though the door itself resisted being opened. When it finally gave way, the hinges groaned like the wail of something ancient and pained. Inside was a small, dust-covered room with a single object at its center, a wooden chest bound with heavy iron locks. The air inside was stifling, and the faint scent of decayed earth hung in the room. Lucas approached the chest cautiously, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. As he opened the lid, the hinges screeched, releasing a cloud of dust and the unmistakable scent of mildew. Inside, he found an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges singed as if it had narrowly escaped a fire. The name etched on the front struck him like a blow, Eleanor Carter. It was his mother's name. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, the ink faded but still legible. The entries detailed her stay at the hotel decades ago. She wrote of hearing whispers in the night and seeing shadows circling the bottomless pit. Her last entry chilled him to the core. "The pit calls to me, and I cannot resist. If someone finds this, know that it watches all who come near." As Lucas processed the revelation, a distant hum began to fill the room, growing louder and more oppressive by the second. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own, plunging the room into darkness. The journal fell from his hands, landing open to a page he hadn't read. The words on it were freshly written, as if someone had just scrawled them. "Lucas, you were always meant to return." His mind reeled. Memories long buried clawed their way to the surface, his mother's voice humming a haunting lullaby, one he had heard faintly the night before. He remembered her abrupt disappearance when he was just a child, the police claiming she had abandoned him, but now he knew the truth. She had been claimed by the pit. The weight of her fate pressed down on him, and the journal seemed to pulsate with an unnatural heat, burning his fingertips as he picked it up. Before he could escape the suffocating room, a voice, soft, melodic, and eerily familiar, filled the air. It was his mother's voice, singing the lullaby. Down, down, where the shadows grow, into the pit where no light shows. It echoed around him, both comforting and terrifying. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the singing stopped, replaced by a whisper that felt like it came from inside his own skull. "Do not run, Lucas. The truth lies below." Lucas burst out of the room, clutching the journal to his chest as if it were a lifeline. The hotel seemed to shift around him again, the corridors twisting and elongating, leading him back toward his room. But something was different now. The pit's presence was no longer distant. It felt alive, pulsating beneath his feet. He realized that whatever force had claimed his mother was now watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The air in Lucas's room grew colder as night fell, carrying with it an oppressive stillness that seemed to crush the breath from his lungs. He sat at the small, rickety desk, the journal open in front of him. Each word his mother had written seemed to echo in his mind, filling the silence with her voice. "The pit calls to me." Her final entry replayed over and over in his thoughts like a broken record. Outside the window, the bottomless pit loomed, its darkness even more unnatural in the faint moonlight. Shadows seemed to writhe around its edges, and every so often, Lucas thought he could see something, or someone, move at the rim. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but deep down he knew better. Suddenly, the journal's pages flipped violently, as if struck by an invisible hand. The room dimmed, and the single flickering bulb above him buzzed loudly before plunging the space into darkness. A cold draft swept through, carrying the faint sound of a melody. It was the lullaby again, the one his mother had sung to him when he was a child. But now it was distorted, echoing as though it came from deep within a cavern. He froze as the voice shifted, becoming a low whisper. "Lucas, come to me." The whispers grew louder, layering over each other, filling his mind like a cacophony of ghostly voices. He clutched his head, stumbling back as an intense pressure filled his skull. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and when Lucas opened his eyes, he wasn't alone. A figure stood at the edge of the room, shrouded in shadow. Its outline was humanoid, but its form shimmered and twisted unnaturally, as if it were only partially in this world. Who are you?" Lucas's voice cracked, barely a whisper. The figure stepped forward, its face obscured by darkness, yet its presence filled the room with a suffocating dread. "I am the one who watches," it said, its voice an amalgamation of countless others, men, women, children, layered together in a haunting symphony. "You were called here for a reason, Lucas. The pit demands what was promised." "What promise?" "I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure raised a hand, and suddenly Lucas was overwhelmed by a rush of memories, images of his mother, standing at the edge of the pit, her face pale and tear-streaked. She held a bundle in her arms, a baby. Him. She whispered something into the darkness before stepping away. The vision shifted, and Lucas saw himself as a boy, humming the lullaby, completely unaware of the shadow that loomed behind him. His mother had made a bargain, one she couldn't keep, and now it was his turn to pay the price. The figure stepped closer, extending a hand that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. "You have two choices, Lucas," it said, its tone devoid of emotion. "Step into the pit and fulfill your destiny, or leave and carry the burden of its wrath. But know this, should you run, it will find those you care about. One way or another, the pit always collects its due." Lucas staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The room twisted around him, the walls seeming to close in. The journal on the desk began to glow faintly, and he realized it wasn't just an object. It was a conduit, tethering him to the pit's will. As he approached it, the pages flipped again, revealing a new message scrawled in fresh ink. "Sacrifice what you hold dear, or they will suffer." He dropped the journal, its heat scorching his palms, and stumbled toward the door. But when he tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. The shadow figure spoke again, its voice now right behind him. "Choose, Lucas. Will you give yourself, or will you condemn them?" Images flashed through his mind, his estranged father, his few close friends, the people he had pushed away in his pursuit of a solitary life. He saw them crying out for help, their faces contorted in terror as unseen forces pulled them into the abyss. The thought of their suffering clawed at his sanity. But the alternative, to plunge into the pit himself, filled him with a dread so profound it left him paralyzed. The figure raised both hands, and the room dissolved into a horrifying vision. Lucas found himself standing at the edge of the pit. Below, the darkness seemed to swirl like a living thing, tendrils of shadow reaching upward, hungry for him. Voices rose from its depths, some crying for help, others screaming in agony, and one unmistakably his mother's. "Lucas, save them. End this." Tears streamed down his face as he realized there was no escape. The pit wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything from him. He had to choose, sacrifice himself and hope to break the cycle, or flee and doom those he loved to an eternity of torment. His hands trembled as he stepped closer to the edge, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse, beckoning him forward. As he stared into the abyss, he whispered, "I can't. I'm not ready." The figure appeared beside him, its voice softer now, almost pitying. "No one ever is." The pit's darkness surged upward, and Lucas's screams were swallowed whole. Lucas awoke in a cold sweat, his pulse hammering in his ears. The room was steeped in darkness, the faint glow of the moon outside now completely obscured. The air was dense, suffocating, as if the very walls of the hotel were pressing in on him. He reached for the lamp on the bedside table, but it flickered weakly before plunging the room into total blackness once again. It was then that he noticed it, a faint whisper, barely audible, curling through the air like smoke. The sound was distant at first, like a low murmur carried on the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. Words emerged from the noise, though their meaning was fragmented, lost, forever. "The pit watches." Lucas sat frozen in his bed, his breath caught in his throat. The whispers seemed to circle him, emanating from every corner of the room. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind outside, but the voices were too deliberate, too human to dismiss. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, yet it reverberated through the room with unnatural force. 3 sharp raps on the door, followed by silence. Lucas stared at the door, every muscle in his body screaming for him to stay where he was. But the whispers intensified, now accompanied by a faint scratching sound, as if nails were being dragged along the wooden floor. Gathering what courage he could muster, Lucas crept toward the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. There was no response, only the scratching sound growing louder, closer. He yanked the door open, and the hallway beyond stretched unnaturally long, disappearing into a void of shadows. The lanterns lining the corridor flickered erratically, casting distorted, writhing shapes along the walls. At the far end of the hallway, something moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker of motion just beyond the reach of the light. Lucas squinted, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was tall, impossibly thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. It stood still for a moment, then tilted its head in a way that made Lucas's stomach churn. Without warning, it took a step forward, and then another, its form vanishing and reappearing with each flicker of the lights. Panicking, Lucas slammed the door shut, but the whispers were now inside the room. They were louder, urgent, speaking directly to him in overlapping voices. "You cannot run. The pit is waiting." His reflection in the mirror caught his attention. At first, it was normal, showing his wide-eyed, terrified face. But then, slowly, the reflection began to change. The shadows in the room gathered around his mirrored image, twisting it into something grotesque. His face stretched unnaturally, his eyes hollow and black. The reflection grinned, its teeth sharp and glinting in the faint light. The lamp beside him buzzed to life, casting the room in a dim glow. The reflection froze, its twisted grin fading into a look of malice. Then it spoke, not with its mouth, but directly into his mind. "You belong to the pit. You always have." The glass of the mirror cracked violently, sending shards flying across the room. Lucas stumbled back, clutching his arm as a thin line of blood appeared where a shard had grazed him. The walls began to groan, as if the entire hotel were alive and aware of his fear. The whispers converged into a single chilling voice. "Lucas, come to us." A shadow darker than anything he had ever seen seeped from beneath the door, spreading across the floor like spilled ink. It crept toward him, pulsating as if it had a heartbeat of its own. He backed away until his spine hit the far wall, but the shadow reached him, curling around his legs like icy tendrils. The room began to shift, the walls stretching and warping as though the space itself were being swallowed by the pit's influence. The window shattered outward, revealing the abyss below. Though he was several floors above the courtyard, the pit was impossibly close, its blackness filling the view like an endless, yawning mouth. The whispers were now deafening, accompanied by a low, guttural hum that made Lucas's teeth ache. The shadow tendrils pulled at him, dragging him toward the broken window. He clawed at the floor, his nails splintering against the wood, but the force was unrelenting. Just as he thought he would be pulled into the abyss, the whispers stopped. Silence fell over the room, broken only by his ragged breathing. A single voice, calm and eerily soothing, spoke behind him. "You're closer than you think, Lucas. The pit is already inside you." He turned slowly, and there, standing in the center of the room, was his mother. Or at least, something wearing her face. Her eyes were voids of darkness, her smile too wide, too perfect. She extended a hand toward him, and when she spoke, it was with the layered voices of countless others. "Come with me. It's the only way to end this." Lucas screamed, the sound swallowed by the shadows enveloping the room. The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy, as though it had been drained of all oxygen. Lucas's scream echoed back at him, distorted and layered with unfamiliar voices, before being swallowed by the oppressive silence. His mother, or the thing that wore her face, stood motionless, her outstretched hand trembling slightly. "You're afraid," the figure said, its voice an unsettling blend of compassion and menace. "But fear is the key, Lucas. Fear will guide you." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, and overwhelmingly loud. Lucas pressed his hands to his ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't external. It was inside him, resonating through his bones. The broken shards of the mirror on the floor began to move, dragged by unseen forces, arranging themselves into a perfect circle at his feet. As he stared, the shards reflected images that weren't his own, flashes of faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. The reflections began to shift, showing scenes from Lucas's past. He saw himself as a boy, crying alone in the dark after his mother disappeared. He saw the nights spent sleepless, haunted by nightmares he couldn't explain. But then, the images began to change. He saw things that never happened, or things he couldn't remember. His younger self stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into its black depths. A voice, soft, almost tender, whispered to the boy, though Lucas couldn't make out the words. "Do you see it now?" the figure asked, stepping closer. Its voice was hypnotic, drawing Lucas's gaze back to its face. It no longer resembled his mother entirely. The edges of its features blurred, shifting like smoke, and its eyes grew deeper, darker, pulling him in. The fear has always been with you. It's why you came here. It's why you belong to the pit. The room began to spin. The walls melted away, replaced by an infinite void that stretched in every direction. Lucas was no longer in the hotel. He was standing on the edge of the pit itself, though the edges of the abyss seemed impossibly vast, far beyond what he had seen in the courtyard. The darkness below churned like a living thing, its surface rippling with faint shapes that rose and fell. He squinted, and the shapes became clearer, faces. Hundreds of them, mouths open in anguish, eyes wide with terror, staring up at him. "You've felt it your entire life, haven't you?" the figure continued, now circling him. "The fear of being alone. The fear of the unknown. The fear of becoming something you don't understand." Its words coiled around him like a snake, tightening with each syllable. "Fear isn't your enemy, Lucas. It's your purpose." The faces in the pit began to change. He recognized them, his estranged father, the few friends he had pushed away, even fleeting acquaintances he had long forgotten. Their expressions were frozen in torment, but their eyes seemed alive, pleading silently with him. "You can save them," the figure said, its voice now a whisper in his ear. "You have the power to end their suffering. All you have to do is let go." Lucas backed away from the edge, shaking his head violently. "No, this isn't real. None of this is real," he shouted, but his voice sounded hollow, as though the void had drained it of any strength. The figure laughed softly, a sound that sent icy chills down his spine. "Reality is irrelevant, Lucas. The pit is all that matters, and it is waiting for you." Suddenly, the void shifted again. Lucas found himself back in his childhood bedroom. The soft glow of a night light cast familiar shadows across the walls, and the faint sound of his mother's lullaby played in the background. He was a child again, small and frightened, clutching a stuffed animal to his chest. But something was wrong. The shadows on the walls began to move independently of their sources, growing larger and more menacing. One by one, they peeled away from the walls and crept toward him, their forms shifting into grotesque shapes with elongated limbs and hollow faces. "You remember this, don't you?" the figure asked, its voice now coming from everywhere at once. "The first time you felt true fear. The first time you realized you were different." The shadows closed in, their cold, spectral fingers brushing against his skin. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The lullaby grew louder, its melody twisting into something discordant and sinister. "Make it stop," Lucas cried, his voice breaking. "Please make it stop." The shadows froze, their featureless faces tilting as if amused by his desperation. The figure appeared before him again, now fully formed and impossibly tall, its presence dwarfing the small room. "There's only one way to stop it," it said, extending its hand once more. "Embrace the fear. Let it consume you. Only then will you understand." Lucas stared at the hand, his mind racing. The shadows began to move again, faster this time, their shapes merging into a single, towering mass that loomed over him. The lullaby reached a fever pitch, drowning out his thoughts. His body trembled as he realized the truth. The pit wasn't just outside. It was inside him, and it always had been. Lucas stood on the precipice of despair, his trembling body drenched in cold sweat. The room around him flickered and warped, dissolving into the void that now consumed his reality. He was no longer in the hotel, nor entirely in the world he knew. The pit stretched endlessly before him, its darkness a living, breathing entity, pulsating with an energy that made his chest tighten. Tendrils of shadow slithered upward, writhing like serpents, as though they could smell his fear. The figure that had tormented him emerged from the void once more, its form shifting between his mother, himself, and something far more sinister, a grotesque amalgamation of every face he had seen in the pit. "You've reached the end, Lucas," it said, its voice a thunderous chorus of overlapping whispers. "There is no turning back. The pit demands your truth." Lucas clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to steady his breathing. "What truth?" he shouted into the void. "What do you want from me?" The figure's face contorted into an unnatural grin, its blackened eyes locking onto his. "Your fear, Lucas. Your secrets. You cannot hide them any longer." As the words echoed through the void, the ground beneath Lucas began to shift. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance as jagged fragments of memory rose from the darkness like shards of glass. Each fragment was a scene from his life, moments of shame, guilt, and fear that he had buried deep within himself. In one shard, He saw himself as a child, standing at the edge of the pit with his mother. She was crying, whispering words he couldn't understand. The memory burned into his mind, her desperate gaze, the way she clutched his hand before letting go and stepping into the darkness. She made the first offering, the figure hissed. "And now it's your turn." Lucas recoiled, shaking his head. "No, she didn't abandon me. She was trying to protect me." His voice wavered, filled with equal parts anger and desperation. But even as he said the words, the shards showed him a different truth. His mother's sacrifice hadn't been to save him. It had been to delay the pit's hunger. She had left him marked, a tether to the abyss that had awaited his return. The void around him shifted again, and he found himself standing in a hallway filled with mirrors. Each reflection showed a different version of himself. Some were gaunt and lifeless, others twisted and monstrous, their eyes glowing with malevolence. The whispers returned louder this time, repeating a single phrase, "The pit is in you." The largest mirror shattered suddenly, revealing a gaping hole on the other side. From its depths, a voice, his voice, called out, taunting him. "You've always known, haven't you? That you'd end up here. That you'd never escape." The tendrils of shadow surged toward him, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the opening. Lucas clawed at the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the pull was too strong. As he was dragged closer, the figure appeared again, now fully engulfed in flames of shadow. "The truth, Lucas," it said, its voice booming like thunder. "Do you surrender, or do you fight? One will destroy you. The other will destroy everything you love." Lucas's mind raced as the options weighed on him. If he surrendered to the pit, would it truly end? Or would it claim even more? If he fought, could he escape, or would it unleash its wrath on the world he had tried to leave behind? The faces of his loved ones flashed before him. His father, his friends, the people he had distanced himself from. Their cries of anguish echoed in his ears, blending with the cacophony of the pit. In his desperation, he grabbed a shard of the mirror, its jagged edge slicing into his palm. The pain grounded him, giving him a fleeting sense of clarity. He stared into the shard, seeing his reflection, eyes wide, face pale but alive. "You don't own me," he whispered, his voice trembling but defiant. "You never did." The figure roared, its shadowy form convulsing violently. "You cannot defy the pit. It is your destiny." The shadows surged toward him, but Lucas stood his ground. Clutching the shard tightly, he plunged it into the tendrils that bound him. A blinding light erupted from the wound, and the void screamed in agony. The pit began to collapse, its darkness spiraling inward like water down a drain. The ground beneath Lucas gave way, and he fell, tumbling through the void as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Just as he thought he would be consumed entirely, he landed with a jolt. Lucas opened his eyes to find himself back in his room at the hotel. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone. The journal lay closed on the desk, its cover untouched. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But when he looked at his hand, the cut from the mirror shard was still there, blood drying on his palm. Outside the window, the pit remained, but its shadows no longer writhed. It was silent, waiting, watching. As Lucas sat in the eerie quiet of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The pit had retreated, but it wasn't gone. It never would be. "The pit is in you." The words echoed faintly in his mind as the shadows in the corners of the room began to stir once more. Lucas stood at the edge of the courtyard, the cold wind cutting through his skin like icy knives. The bottomless pit loomed before him, its darkness alive, pulsating like a giant heart buried within the earth. The hotel behind him felt distant, its eerie silhouette fading into the blackened sky. He clutched the journal tightly in his hands, its pages now blank, as if the pit had devoured its contents. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, a chaotic symphony of voices urging him forward, taunting him, tempting him. "You've come this far," the figure's voice echoed, emanating from the pit itself. It no longer needed to manifest physically. It was everywhere, inside the wind, the shadows, and Lucas's own mind. "Do you think you can escape your fate? There is no running from what you are." The ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Cracks snaked outward from the rim of the pit, and from its depths, tendrils of darkness rose, coiling and uncoiling like massive serpents. They reached for him, stopping just short of his body, as if savoring his fear. Lucas took a step back, but the tendrils followed, their movements deliberate, predatory. "This is not destiny," Lucas shouted, his voice trembling but firm. "You've been feeding on my fear, my pain, but it ends here." The pit responded with a deep, guttural rumble that reverberated through the canyon. The tendrils struck the ground around him, creating small craters, their force shaking the earth. From the pit's churning depths, figures began to emerge, shadowy, half-formed shapes that resembled people Lucas had seen in his visions. Their faces were frozen in agony, mouths open in silent screams, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Among them, one figure stood out, his mother. "Lucas," she called, her voice weak and distorted, as though it were coming from underwater. "You can still save me. Save us." Her arms reached toward him, but the shadows around her seemed to pull her back, twisting her form into something monstrous. The sight made Lucas's stomach churn, but he couldn't look away. The figure's voice returned, booming from all directions. "She is lost to you, Lucas. They all are. Unless you do what must be done. What do you want from me?" Lucas screamed, his desperation boiling over. The journal in his hands began to glow faintly, its blank pages filling with strange, incomprehensible symbols. The glow spread to his hands, then to his entire body, until he felt as though he were burning from the inside out. The pain was excruciating, but it brought with it a strange clarity. The pit had been lying to him, or at least twisting the truth. It didn't just want his fear. It wanted him to become a part of it, to join the endless cycle of suffering and despair that fed its existence. But the glowing journal in his hands was a key, a remnant of something stronger than the pit's darkness. It was his only weapon. Lucas stepped closer to the edge, his heart pounding in his chest. "If you want me," he said, his voice steadier now, "you'll have to take all of me." The pit reacted violently, the tendrils lashing out in fury. They struck the ground around him, raising a storm of dust and debris, but Lucas stood his ground. He opened the journal, its pages now blindingly bright, and held it out over the abyss. The symbols on the pages began to move, shifting and aligning to form something coherent, a sigil that pulsed with a golden light. The pit roared, its shadows writhing in pain as the light from the journal grew stronger. The figures emerging from the abyss began to dissolve, their tortured forms turning to wisps of smoke that were carried away on the wind. Lucas's mother reached for him one last time, her face softening into a look of peace before she, too, faded into the light. "You think this will stop me?" The figure's voice snarled, now filled with rage. Its form rose from the pit, towering over Lucas like a living nightmare, its shape constantly shifting between human and beast. "I am eternal. I am fear itself." Lucas's grip tightened on the journal as the light within it began to pulsate faster, growing brighter with each beat. "You're not eternal," he said, his voice ringing with defiance. "You're just a parasite." With a final surge of courage, Lucas hurled the journal into the pit. The moment it left his hands, the light exploded outward, consuming everything in its path. The tendrils disintegrated, the shadows evaporated, and the figure screamed in fury as it was engulfed by the light. The pit itself began to collapse, its edges crumbling inward as the void within it shrank to nothingness. Lucas was thrown backward by the force of the explosion, landing hard on the cold ground. For a moment, everything was silent. The pit was gone, replaced by a smooth, unbroken surface of stone. The hotel stood behind him, eerily quiet, its windows dark and lifeless. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. But as Lucas sat there, catching his breath, he noticed something strange. The stone where the pit had been wasn't entirely smooth. Carved into its surface was a single word, written in the same symbols that had filled the journal: return. Lucas's blood ran cold. He stood and backed away, the realization sinking in. The pit was gone, but its presence remained, lingering in the air like a faint echo. He turned toward the hotel, but it too seemed to have changed. The building now looked pristine, as if it had been newly built. The sign above the entrance shimmered faintly in the moonlight, bearing a new inscription: rooms available. The pit was waiting, patient and eternal. And deep down, Lucas knew it hadn't been defeated. It had only been biding its time. The silence that followed the collapse of the pit was deafening, a void where the oppressive whispers and monstrous growls had once thrived. Lucas stood at the edge of the now smooth stone, staring at the word carved into its surface: return. The cold air seemed to press against him, no longer alive with the pit's malevolence, but still charged with an unshakable sense of dread. He couldn't tell how long he had been standing there. Time felt warped, twisted, as if it no longer obeyed the rules he understood. The journal was gone, swallowed by the abyss before its collapse. Lucas's hands were empty, yet they still tingled with the memory of its searing heat. He stumbled back toward the hotel, his legs weak and his mind clouded with exhaustion. As he crossed the courtyard, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The pit was gone, yet its presence lingered, a shadowless patch of stone that radiated a quiet menace. The word carved into it seemed to pulse faintly, as if waiting for him to make sense of it. Inside the hotel, everything appeared untouched, yet it felt utterly changed. The faint hum of life, the creak of old floorboards, the murmur of wind through cracked windows was absent. The building was still, a mausoleum frozen in time. The lobby was eerily pristine, the furniture no longer dusty, the wallpaper unblemished. Even the strange symbols he had seen carved beneath the peeling wallpaper were gone, as though the hotel had been scrubbed clean of its history. Lucas called out, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The words hung in the air, unanswered. He wandered through the corridors, the faint scent of mildew replaced by a sterile emptiness. He passed room after room, each door slightly ajar, revealing interiors that looked untouched, as if the hotel had been frozen mid-renovation. When he reached the lobby desk, his heart skipped a beat. The pale receptionist was back, standing motionless behind the counter. Her sunken eyes no longer stared into him, but were fixed on something beyond the room, something only she could see. Lucas approached cautiously, but she didn't react. Her lips were slightly parted, and a faint whisper escaped them, soft, incoherent, yet oddly familiar. "Excuse me," Lucas said, his voice shaky. "What happened here? What did I do?" The receptionist's head turned slowly, almost mechanically, until her hollow gaze locked onto his. For the first time, her expression shifted, a smile that was neither kind nor cruel, but something else entirely. "You think it's over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The pit never ends. It only waits." A chill ran down Lucas's spine. He backed away, but the receptionist didn't move. Her smile grew wider, and her whispers became louder, overlapping until they filled the room. The words were unintelligible, yet Lucas felt them burrowing into his mind. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls as he made his way back to his room. When he entered, everything was as he had left it. The bed was unmade, the faint outline of the shattered mirror still visible on the floor. But something was wrong. The air felt heavier again, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, pulsing faintly. On the desk, where the journal had been, sat a small, folded piece of paper. Lucas approached it cautiously, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. The note read, "You brought it back with you." Before he could process the message, the room began to darken. The shadows crept along the walls, stretching toward him like living things. A low hum filled the air, the same guttural vibration he had felt near the pit. Lucas stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness consumed the room entirely, leaving him alone in an endless void. Then the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They spoke his name over and over, layering into a deafening roar. Lucas clutched his head, screaming for it to stop, but the void offered no mercy. From the darkness, the figure emerged once more, its form now indistinct and fluid, shifting between shapes and faces, his mother, himself, and countless others. Its eyes glowed with a terrible light. "You thought you won," it said, its voice a thunderous rumble. "But the pit is eternal. You may escape its grasp, but you will never escape its shadow." Lucas fell to his knees, his body trembling. "What do you want from me?" he cried. "Why won't you let me go?" The figure leaned closer, its many faces twisting into a single, grotesque grin. "You are the key, Lucas. The pit exists through you. As long as you live, so does it." The realization hit him like a physical blow. The pit wasn't just a place, it was a part of him, woven into his very being. Destroying it had only sealed its connection to him, tethering it to his soul. He could leave the hotel, try to return to his life, but the pit would follow. It would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind, waiting for the moment when his fear would feed it again. The figure began to dissolve, its laughter echoing through the void as the shadows receded. The room reappeared around him, but it was different now. The walls were darker, the corners filled with faint, shifting shapes. Lucas sat on the floor, staring at the note in his hand. The words had changed, now reading, "You can't run forever." Outside the window, the courtyard was empty. The pit's stone seal was still there, its carved word, "Return," glowing faintly in the moonlight. The hotel was silent, but Lucas knew better. The pit was waiting. It always would be. And somewhere deep inside, a whisper called his name.